All right, ECE 220 class, let's get started on the curriculum planning presentation. I want to start by talking to you about why we take the time to plan curriculum, why it's not always just spontaneous moments. Spontaneous teachable moments are really, really important, but planning curriculum can help build the environment that allows for those spontaneous moments. So the reason why we plan curriculum is to know what we're doing. Right? We need to be intentional with what we're doing. It helps us to plan ahead and make sure that we have everything that we need. I cannot tell you how many times I have been in classrooms where the adults are not well planned, and it leads to the children having to wait a lot, where they have to sit and just kind of wait for the teachers to catch up, and that's really not good for children. It helps, being planned helps to keep the children engaged at all times. It also helps to ensure that the learning experiences are really appropriate for the children and that they're responsive to the children's needs. It helps us to meet our professional obligations to address certain expectations, whether that's the particular philosophy of the program that we teach in, or the state requirements, or the standards like the Common Core standards. We have to plan intentionally for how we meet those. And then it allows us to help share with families and colleagues what we're doing. Parents and family members want to know what the plan is for their children. Other colleagues can get great ideas from us when we share our planning with them. So it's really important that we are intentional in how we plan. Here are the elements of a curriculum plan. There's the first, the purpose, the why. Again, intentional teaching isn't just about what we're doing or how we're doing it. It's about why we're doing it. Intentional teachers understand the purpose of the interactions that they're having with children and the opportunities that they have provided them. They can articulate why. Then there's the actual content. That's the what are we teaching. Then there's the strategies and methods. That's the how. Okay, what are the different approaches that we're taking? And then finally, there's the assessment piece. And the assessment piece is really, really important because it closes the loop. It's the thing that probably teachers at the early childhood years, like pre-kindergarten, tend to struggle with the most, the idea that they should be documenting and assessing, because we tend to think of assessment as grades that we give people, like formal things that we're looking for, the right answers. But actually assessment, real assessment, is giving feedback and looking in on what the learner is doing and adjusting your plans as the teacher. That's what assessment is really for, to help you as the teacher understand what you need to change. So assessment is really important, even if you're working with infants who should be reflecting constantly on what they're learning and what their next step is. So there's a whole process of designing curriculum. There's a whole cycle that you go through when you're designing and implementing curriculum. And at the very tip top, the reason why this is at the very tip top is that it's the starting place. It's one of the most important things that you need to be doing, and that's observing the children. You watch what the learner is doing. That helps you to understand what they already know, helps you to understand their developmental level. It helps you to understand any socio-cultural contexts that influence how they learn. And once you know all of that, that's when you can start to plan. So I know a lot of people who think, okay, well, I'm working with 3-year-olds, and 3-year-olds are supposed to know colors, so I'm going to research colors on the internet, lesson plans at preschool.com or whatever, and download those lessons. I'm going to do that. But if you haven't really observed the children, you don't know if that's something that they really need to know or not. Maybe they already know it. So taking the time to get to know them helps you to plan your curriculum better. Then once you've realized what the children already know and can do, you start to plan for what are the next steps for them. How do I stretch their learning? How do I create growth across the developmental domains? And that's where you select your content and objectives. That's where you start to look at the what you're going to do. You say, okay, I know now why they need these things, so now I'm going to design the what for them. Then you start looking at the strategies. Once you have clear objectives and content decided, then you say, okay, how am I going to teach this to the children? Like, what environmental changes am I going to make? What kind of direct instruction am I going to do with them? What small group activities will be available to them? What independent work? Those are all those strategies that you start to use. And then you start to select the materials. You say, okay, what physical space, what materials can be used to support their learning in this? Then you start to arrange the environment. You bring those materials in. You set up the environment in a way that is conducive to their learning. And then as the children are working through the content you've decided and working toward the objectives that you've defined for them, you interact with them. You respond to what they're doing. You change things in the moment as they need to be changed. And then as you interact with them, or as you finish up interacting with them, then you go back to the observation model. You're documenting what the children are doing, because that's going to help you now adjust the content and objectives as you go along to the next step. It's really important that you follow this cycle, because if you miss some of these steps, you're going to wind up being frustrated. The children are going to wind up being frustrated, and it just, again, leads to this frustration where nobody's learning and nobody's happy. So let's talk about some of the strategies and methods that you use in that cycle. Play. We've talked about play and the importance of it in the past, how it's the #1 way that children learn. So they need lots of independent, child-directed play, but it's a planned environment for you. Remember back to the curriculum models presentation that I showed you, we had pictures of children engaged in independent play, but the environment was really well planned in such a way to allow them to do that. So that's your part in that. Then there's scaffolding, and that's where you're working with maybe just 1 or 2 children. It's where you're responding in the moment and you're shaping the direction. So when a child, asks you a question or is starting to look frustrated in their independent play, and you step in and maybe offer a provocation or a suggestion or an extension that helps make it even more meaningful to them. You should not be stepping in with scaffolding if the children are working well independently, right? If they're learning lots on their own, and because your environment is so awesome, then you should not be stepping in to provide scaffolding unless they're expressing frustration and they need you as the more competent other to help with that. Then there's large group activities. These are the very teacher planned ones. They're teacher directed. You should be responding to cues from the group. So these are examples of this would be like circle times, where you have large groups of kids together, maybe perhaps the whole class or at least a significant portion of the class are all together listening to you read a story that you've planned out, some finger plays that you've designed, maybe a little activity where they tell you, something and you do dictated writing where you write down their responses to it. Things like that. Those are the large group activities, and that's where people tend to think of as curriculum planning. It's that stuff. But actually curriculum planning is all of these things that we see on the screen here. Then there's small group activities. These are the teacher facilitated ones. These might be like the art projects that you're doing, or a little science investigation, centers activities, learning areas in the classroom. Those are those small group areas where it's well facilitated by you. You are directing it, but you're taking the cues from individual children to adjust it. And again, by taking cues in both the large group and the small group, it might mean that you have to scrap the whole plan that you have and go a different direction with it if you're really following the cues of the children. I've seen so many large group activities or small group activities where children are there kind of against their will and they're not happy, but the teacher just feels they have to get through whatever the lesson is, and they're going to just kind of force it on the child, but it's like the child doesn't want to do this. They don't want to interact anymore. It's time to move on to something else. So when you organize curriculum, there's a variety of ways that you can do that. The integrated approach is really what we're going to be focusing on in this classroom, because it is very learner-centered, okay? An integrated approach is like the idea of units and themes, projects, where all of the developmental domains are being addressed, where multiple curriculum areas, you're doing math, you're doing science, you're doing social emotional learning, you're doing language arts, you're doing physical development. All of those things are happening under this sort of broad topic or idea that you're doing. And that is a very learner-centered approach if you use it as what we call emergent curriculum. Emergent curriculum is a very Reggio Emilia approach, where you look at the child, you're observing what the child is interested in learning, and then you take that and you build the curriculum around that. And I love emergent curriculum because I think children tell us what they're interested in learning, and they learn best when they're interested. So you can do an integrated learner-centered approach. These two things are not mutually exclusive. So what is integrated curriculum? Well, curriculum is where lots of learning is happening as the children are exploring a meaningful topic, and it really is the way that most early childhood educators believe is the best way for children to learn. It just allows for a lot of interaction and a lot of development across multiple domains, which we want to see that. So why do we do integration? Well, We want it to be relevant and meaningful for the children because we want them to be interacting. We want to make help prepare them for a complex world. And a lot of people think that that means we need to oh, children aren't going to have to use computers in the future, so let's get a lot of iPads for the early childhood classroom. And I don't necessarily agree with that approach. I think what we need to be preparing children for is to be the inventor of the next great thing, right? Steve Jobs didn't work on an iPad or an iPod in his early childhood years. He didn't have those things. He invented those things as an adult. And the way he was able to invent those things is because he had a lot of rich, meaningful learning when he was younger that allowed his brain to develop in such a way that he could come up with that sort of creative thinking. And that's what we want to be preparing children for, is that complex integration in the world, the skills, the dispositions for learning, the standards of experience, not the actual content, but the different experiences that will help promote them to create new content later. So we really want experiences. We want it to be an experiential type of curriculum that's really relevant to their real lives. So that's why we take the time to integrate it, because that's how a good curriculum should be. So this brings us to the end of part 1.